Children's Evidence, the United States. Friday, 23 June 1989, 11th Annual Virginia Crime Prevention Conference, Chesapeake, Virginia. Quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robert Hicks, and I am a criminal justice analyst with the Law Enforcement Section of the Department of Criminal Justice Services, Richmond, Virginia. I wish to alert you to a dangerous cult that has implanted itself not only in Virginia, but throughout the country. This group, called the Tnevnoc cult, spelled Tnevnoc, cult, is a, quote, communal sectarian group affiliated with a large and powerful international religious organization, close quote. I can communicate something to you of the methods and goals of the organization by describing the cult's recruitment and indoctrination practices. The cult aims to recruit young women, either teenagers or young adults, and does so openly at schools and colleges. Following indoctrination into the cult, young women eventually lose any power of will, succumbing entirely to the regimen of the cult. Cult members must abandon their former lives, even surrendering their outside friendships and personal possessions. Cult members' activities then involve the cult exclusively. Members must rise at 4:30 in the morning, wear prayer beads attached to their wrists, engage in long, monotonous chants and prayers, and in one of the most bizarre activities, members consumed food they were told represented the dead cult founder's body. Women must even pledge in writing absolute obedience to the cult. To further distance itself from worldly affairs, the cult assigns new names to members and designates as their birthdays the dates of their entry into the cult. After hours of performing menial tasks such as scrubbing floors, coupled with the incessant recitation of ritualistic prayers, members might occasionally transgress rules which are punished harshly. For example, punishment might require women to go without food, having to beg on the knees for crumbs from others' plates. But the most shocking ritual of all required members to become brides to the dead cult leader. I hope that I have sufficiently aroused your curiosity, if not your indignation and anger, that such activities could happen in the United States. In case you haven't figured it out, Tnevnoc is convent spelled backwards. I have just described the socialization of young women into Christian convents, close quote. A clever and memorable trick to enhance understanding, or an indication of a more sinister trend within U.S. law enforcement's analysis of satanic ritual abuse? Hicks would certainly lay claims to the former and condemn the latter view as evidence of the paranoia he believes has derailed much of his colleagues' methodology. Either way, it is perhaps curious that Hicks licensed America's United Wiccan Church as the distributor of his speech. The paper he presented that Friday in June 1989 marked the logical end of a decade in which American detectives had first led the way in understanding ritual abuse and then squandered their lead through internal squabbling and shoddy analysis. When the United States woke to the issue of satanic ritual crime in the early 1980s, it had already undergone a thorough and public scrutiny of its research and responses on the issues of pedophilia and child pornography. A series of Senate and congressional hearings from 1977 onwards had yielded dramatic testimony about the nature and extent of the twin problems and disturbing evidence of the country's inability to handle them. The results of these hearings was a new emphasis from the White House downwards, which placed a higher priority on policing child sexual abuse at home and abroad. There's a footnote. For a fuller account of U.S. policy and practice, see Child Pornography and Investigation, Methuen, 1990. End of footnote. Although individual police departments periodically recorded cases of bizarre and apparently occult-related offenses from homicide to indecency, national attention was only drawn to the problem of ritual abuse after a series of child sex scandals in daycare or preschool centers across the country. The first such case centered around the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. We shall examine the McMartin affair, America's longest, costliest, and least successful criminal prosecution ever, when we analyze the world's two most important ritual abuse cases in detail in the next chapter. But McMartin was followed by an apparent epidemic of similar cases, each engendering ever greater controversy which only increased as the allegations grew from ordinary child molestation to claims of ritual abuse, torture, and murder. The cases had at first been handled with a degree of self-confidence. America had looked into itself and discovered the awful reality of child sexual abuse. Now it knew the problem and how to solve it. But with the first hints of Satanism came polarization, acrimony, and a culture of disbelief. The nation that had done so much to police child sexual crimes across the globe began to tear itself apart over a familiar question: can we believe the children? Policing Satanism, America. Between 1985 and 1990, U.S. juries convicted 15 adults for sexual abuse in cases where the victims alleged that rituals took place. But in only 3 of the 9 cases was evidence of the rituals introduced. In the remainder, it was filtered out by either federal or local prosecuting attorneys. The first was the Miami Country Walk Babysitting Service case in 1985. As we saw in Chapter 2, although never specifically prosecuted as ritual abuse, not only did the victims' testimonies match most of the key indicators as defined by Pam Hudson, but one of the perpetrators, Ileana Fuster, pleaded guilty halfway through the trial. It is worth listing the details contained in the statements of more than a dozen children, which Fuster agreed to be accurate. Her husband Frank had regularly ordered her to undress in front of the children and to perform oral sex on them. Sometimes both wore white robes and green masks to carry out the abuse. Their victims had been made to drink a liquid combination of urine, tranquilizers, and pop. Frank Fuster had also made the children watch him rape his wife with a crucifix and then killed a number of blue parakeets to frighten them into silence. Videotapes had indeed, as the children alleged, been made of the rituals. That none were found, according to Ileana, was the work of one of her husband's accomplices. He had removed them the night before Frank Fuster was arrested. Not only did the Country Walk case provide the first recorded case of multiple ritual abuse in the United States, it also managed to highlight the flaws in law enforcement's approach to such reports. Initial response to the children's allegations about Ileana and Frank Fuster was left in the hands of a caseworker, a generic and frequently inexperienced level of social worker, rather than being immediately adopted by local police. The caseworker in question had never investigated a case of what she quaintly called sexual harassment before. During the trial, it emerged that her method of inquiry was to arrive at the Fuster's center unannounced, knock on the door, and ask Ileana if she had been sexually harassing any children. The trial transcript continues. Quote, "Did you speak to any of the children? No. Did you speak to any of the parents? No. Did you get any names of children or parents? No. Did you try to track down the source of the complaint? No. Did you ever do anything other than ask the woman who answered the door whether she was sexually harassing children? No." Close quote. The caseworker then returned to her office and listed the complaints as unfounded. Only a determined and vocal campaign by parents of the children involved forced a trial which Ileana turned state's evidence and Frank Fuster received consecutive life sentences. But the law enforcement lessons do not end with the inadequacies of an individual caseworker. Children at the Country Walk Center had repeatedly and independently told investigators that they had been made to drink a liquid they called demon slime, that the abuse had taken the form of games, quote, the caca excrement game and the pee urine game, close quote, being the most common, that Frank Fuster killed animals, including some bluebirds in front of them, and that the proceedings had been videotaped. Rather than trying to place these seemingly bizarre allegations in some form of context, the prosecutor simply left them hanging in the evidence with no attempt at explanation. To the Fusters' defense lawyers, this was meat and drink. Both attorneys, the couple were separately represented, argued that it proved the children were fantasizing the entire abuse story. Ileana's counsel went further, accusing the children's therapist of, quote, a more subtle form of coercion than the North Vietnamese did to our prisoners of war, close quote. It was to be an allegation commonly heard in the years between 1985 and 1990. Had it not been for Ileana Fuster's sudden decision to plead guilty and testify against her husband, the Country Walk prosecution would almost certainly have collapsed, the victims of inadequate law enforcement research and intelligence. One final lesson should have emerged from the case. The child victims at Country Walk had alleged that their abuse was videotaped. None were found, yet Ileana Fuster confirmed the stories. In case after subsequent case, the children would be disbelieved about allegations of ritual abuse because they refused to retract claims that the ceremonies had been videotaped when none were found. Had U.S. law enforcement taken the trouble to study the transcripts of Ileana Fuster's evidence, they would have found a possible explanation for the missing tapes. Quite simply, that a fellow cult member removed them. 6 of the remaining 8 successful American prosecutions revealed ritual abuse taking place in daycare centers, although the prosecutions made little or no reference to the ritual aspect. In only 2 cases was there no daycare involved, but in each case, the prosecuting attorney took a decision to allow evidence of rituals to go before the jury. The first of these was in Santa Rosa, California, and resulted in substantial prison terms for Daryl Ball and Charlotte Thrailkill after lengthy plea bargaining on multiple molestation charges. The second concerned a former chief civil deputy in the sheriff's office, Thurston County, Washington State, called Paul Ingram. His case was, in the event, easier than most, at least insofar as it concerned him personally. Ingram pleaded guilty to ritually abusing an indefinite number of children over a 17-year period. But his allegations that he was not alone, that a second deputy and a state patrol employee were also involved, were dismissed and never followed up. The details of the Santa Rosa and Thurston County allegations need not, in the event, concern us. They matched, claim for ritual claim, those made by children across America and throughout Europe and Australia. Instead, we need to examine why other prosecutions either failed or were never brought, and to do that, we must investigate the investigators themselves, the U.S. law enforcement community. Quote, this issue has divided investigators like no other before. It has become the situation that if you work this field, you have to take one side or the other, for or against. And if you don't agree with what one side is thinking, then to them, you're one of the bad guys. You've gone over to the other side. To me, that's sick thinking, and I just don't want any part of it anymore, close quote. This was the view of the detective with probably the most experienced, most rigorous mind, and most balanced approach on the thorny problem of ritual abuse, expressed in January 1991. Sandra Daly Bargioni, intelligence officer, graduate in criminology and cult crime specialist, left ritual abuse casework in the middle of 1989, exhausted both by the nature of the cases and by the polarization of opinion within the law enforcement community. Sandra Bargioni is better known by her name before marriage, Sandy Gallant. For nearly a decade, she was the doyenne of cult investigations, and room 558 in San Francisco Police Department's Criminal Intelligence Building at 850 Bryant, the mecca of all those with a bizarre case to solve. A small, impatient woman, she joined the San Francisco Police Department in 1964 as a civilian fingerprint technician. Relatively quickly, she signed up as a uniformed cop before graduating to plainclothes detective work. She was assigned to the Intelligence Division in the late 1970s with a brief to detect emerging trends in criminal behavior and predict the direction of forthcoming organized crime activity. Inevitably, Southern California has fully earned its reputation for attracting more than its fair share of crazies. This brought her into contact with the myriad networks of quasi-religious cults that littered the coast after the collapse of the flower power era. One of these was Satanism. Gallant's research into satanic cults, careful, methodical, and painstaking, soon earned her the epithet of Satan's cop from her colleagues and the enmity of a defensive occult world. As it turned out, neither was justified. Satanism formed only a small part of her brief, albeit one that guaranteed headlines. And she was equally interested in drugs, terrorism, and a raft of other potentially criminal cults from Caribbean voodoo to Latin American Santeria. Quote, I did not ever do ritualistic crimes day in and day out. I actively worked on only a few selected cases as an officer investigating with a view to prosecution. Obviously, since I am in the intelligence division, my job is to keep information and files on a variety of groups. I cover everything from organized crime to drugs. But the view that has been put out about Sandy Gallant single-handedly taking on the occult and persuading San Francisco Police Department to set up America's only ritualistic crime detail is pure baloney. If such a detail ever existed, I was it, and I didn't work the field full time even before I gave it up, close quote. The polarization within U.S. law enforcement is a self-inflicted wound which has effectively paralyzed any unified attempt at understanding or controlling the groups which practice ritual abuse. According to Gallant, quote, if the FBI could just spend a year researching the problem, investigating, finding out what's really going on, then I think we could get a whole lot further. This, in some ways, is like the situation we found when we first confronted child pornography. If we look, we find it. The problem for America now is that we have a series of local cops doing ritual abuse casework, sometimes on very shaky grounds, and no one is putting together the information gleaned into an overview, close quote. The FBI, of course, has carried out some research. Its behavioral science unit has hosted and provided speakers for the growing number of conferences and seminars covering the issue of ritual crime. In particular, Ken Lanning has made genuine efforts to study and draw lessons from the patchwork of information spread throughout the United States. That research alone places him within the moderate group of American detectives with a view on the subject. At the close of the 1980s, there were three rival factions within the U.S. law enforcement community. There were those like Robert Hicks, whose views were nakedly skeptical. Opposing him were openly Christian detectives whose faith rather than forensic skills led them to near unquestioning acceptance. Between them were isolated and moderate professional investigators who weighed up evidence and assessed each case that came before them on its individual merits. With a weary inevitability, they were snipped at from both extreme wings. We need first to examine what became known as, quote, Christ's cops, close quote, since much of the opposing debate amounted to an attack on their religious affiliations rather than on the concept of ritual crime itself. The most influential of these religiously motivated investigators is Larry Jones from the relatively insignificant Boise, Idaho Police Department. Jones, who makes no secret of his Christianity, is the moving force behind an organization called Occult Crime Network Incorporated and publisher of its restricted journal, File 18. File 18 was first published in 1985 and is mailed quarterly to at least 1,500 subscribers. Most are involved, officially or not, in investigating ritual crime. Jones advises his readers that they should investigate mockery of the Christian sacraments and claims that there is a major international conspiracy of upper-level Satanists who plan to take over the world. Quote, I don't mean to sound paranoid, close quote, he told Newsweek magazine in December 1988, but the walls have ears for us now, close quote. The problem with Jones is precisely that he is paranoid, an instability born out of religious zeal, fostered by the evident decline in support for Orthodox Christianity, and fed by the bogus scare stories. Of these, the so-called Wicca letters are the most famous and most pervasive, turning up endlessly in Christian publications with a distinctly fundamentalist bias. Purporting to be a world domination master plan drawn up by a non-existent cult organization called Witches International Coven Council, Wicca, the document is a piece of classic Black propaganda in the tradition of the anti-Semitic Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Like that rabid and deranged text, the Wicca letters bear no resemblance to reality or empirical truth. Despite this, their contents have been widely, gratefully, and uncritically presented to their readers of File 18. The document lists 7 goals of the alleged Wicca world domination conspiracy. Number 1, to bring the covens, both black and white magic, into one and have the Arctress, a sort of international high priestess, to govern all. After that, it says accomplished. 2, to bring about personal deaths causing discord and disharmony within families. After that, it says accomplished. Number 3, to remove or educate the New Age youth by A, infiltrating boys, girls clubs, and big sister brother programs, infiltrating schools, having prayers removed, having teachers teach about drugs, sex, freedoms. C, instigating and promoting rebellion against parents and all authority. And D, promoting equal rights for youth. Under that, it says accomplished. Number 4, to gain access to all people's backgrounds and vital information by A, use of computers, B, convenience, and C, infiltration. Under that, it says accomplished. Number 5, to have laws changed to benefit our ways, such as A, removing children from the home environment and placing them in our foster homes. B, mandatory placement of children in our daycare centers. C, increased taxes. D, open drug and pornography market. Under that, it says not yet accomplished. Number 6, to destroy government agencies by A, overspending, B, public opinion, C, being on the offensive always, opposing, demonstrating, demoralizing. Under that, it says not yet accomplished. Number 7, not to be revealed until all else has been accomplished. Target date for revelation, June 21st, 1986. The beginning of the summer solstice and great feast on the Satanic calendar. Close quote. If this rabid rambling seems too absurd for belief, Larry Jones and his cult crime network followers have been eager to accept it. Jones has mailed out copies to accompany File 18 newsletter. The grand satanic conspiracy theory forms the basis of CNN's worldview. Despite the absence of genuine facts to support it, Jones explains away that problem by turning the argument on its head. Quote, those who deny, explain away, or cover up the obvious, undeniable growing mountain of evidence often demand statistical evidence or positive linkages between operational suspected groups. At best, this demand for positive proof of a horizontal conspiracy is naive. Consider the possibility that the reason supposedly unrelated groups in different localities over various time periods acting out in a similar manner is that consistent directives are received independently from higher levels of authority. Instead of being directly linked to each other, these groups may be linked vertically to a common source of direction and control. This vertical conspiracy model is consistent with the authoritarian structure seen in many cult and occult groups. Those who accept this theory as a reasonable possibility need to rethink the meaning, scope, and effect of the term conspiracy. Close quote. The chief problem with this explanation for the remarkable similarity of testimony from child survivors is that it is based on a fictional conspiracy. The most likely reason for the repetition across the world of key indicators of ritual abuse is that satanic worship exists to its own folk memory pattern, that is, that a large number of individual groups follow the historic practices of devil worship without any supervisory control of a world council of super Satanists. Sadly, CNN's influence has been extensive and has led to ever more extreme interpretations by groups without Jones's few sensibilities. The Idaho officer has at least conceded that witchcraft and Satanism are different and distinct religions. Of these, the worst is undoubtedly that founded and run by Lyndon H. LaRouche. LaRouche, a rabid, anti-communist, occasional Democratic presidential candidate, and in 1989 occupant of a federal jail cell for earlier dishonesty, publishes a number of self-promoting magazines from America and Germany. These rejoice variously in the titles Executive Intelligence Review, Investigative Leads, and The New Federalist. Some of their journalism is soundly based. Investigative Leads, for example, has been at the forefront of penetrating the dense geometrical psychobabble of the OTO lodges to reveal individual criminal behavior which it obscures. But the LaRouche-inspired analysis is paranoid gibberish, determinedly promoting the grand international occult conspiracy theory. Quote, there was an extraordinary mobilization in the first month of 1988 by Gnostic sects and cults, openly seeking to subvert both the political social process and the military and intelligence services of Western nations. These groups literally believed themselves to be the Antichrist. Among coordinating agencies behind this mobilization are the Ordo Templi Orientis, Wicca, the Gnostic Church, the psychoanalytical networks associated with the late Gnostic psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, important elements of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and factions of the Socialist International. The leading circles of these groups are well connected to the intelligence services of the Eastern Bloc, close quote. It is hardly surprising that such errant nonsense attracts widespread hostility among American police forces. But it is precisely because U.S. law enforcement has almost entirely failed to tackle the problem of ritual abuse that groups of frustrated parents whose children were victims have turned to the less reliable freelance cult investigators who blend genuine case evidence with prejudice against anything from witchcraft to fantasy role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. This, in turn, has created an ever deeper antagonism and skepticism from already suspicious detectives, a vicious circle with children as the ultimate losers. The man who best exemplifies the skeptics is Robert Hicks, a criminal analyst rather than a hands-on investigator. Like his opposite numbers in the CCN, Hicks begins his analysis from a sound and rational base. Quote, child abuse does exist. Some people commit violent crimes while invoking the power of Satan. Such people may act with others, but law enforcement enforcers cannot demonstrate the existence of a widespread satanic conspiracy, the evidence does not exist. No evidence links fantasy role-playing games to teen suicides. Officers can and should stick to the constitutional basics. They investigate irregular behavior based on a well-founded and legally defined reasonable suspicion. They arrest based on probable cause. No one expects police to ignore pentagrams drawn in blood at a homicide scene. Complete documentation of crime scenes has always been the rule, but we have no justification for carrying on unwarranted explorations of the beliefs of an unpopular few and for waving books of satanic liturgy at seminars and pronouncing them dangerous. Close quote. It is this last sentence which betrays Hicks. His understandable hostility to the paranoid fantasies of LaRouche and Larry Jones has led him to an equally shrill opinion. His own lectures at what might be best described as anti-satanic crime seminars clearly illustrate an analyst who has allowed skepticism and prejudice to get the better of the facts. Quote, despite this large-scale conspiracy alleged by Jones, etc., police have still uncovered no evidence of cult's murderous activities. No evidence supports the idea that daycare workers subject children to abuse and propitiation of Satan. No evidence exists supporting the literal truth of cult survivors' claims. Close quote. Leaving aside the successfully prosecuted cases, leaving aside even the multiplicity of evidence surrounding the process church of the final judgment, ignoring even the clear incitements to murder in Crowley's rituals, Hicks' analysis is deeply flawed because it is entirely negative. He advances no explanation other than the suggestion that leading questions had been put by conspiracy-minded therapists for the identical disclosures of child victims across the globe. By allowing his anti-Christian bias to dominate, Hicks encourages the view that satanic ritual abuse does not exist. His position is that a neat reversal of the CCN line, because law enforcement has failed to validate children's statements about Satanism, although gratefully prosecuting on the rest of their evidence of abuse, this proves that satanic ritual abuse does not exist. In fact, it does no such thing, and Hicks' allegation is as untenable as his opponent's conspiracy theories. Repeatedly throughout 1989, he drew audiences to lectures on this negative approach, specifically warning investigators not to undertake intelligence gathering on satanic groups because there was no evidence to link them to criminal activity. Quote, while cult seminar presenters caution about respecting First Amendment rights of citizens practicing unusual beliefs, the same officers can't help but inflect their bias on audiences. Anything that is not mainstream Christianity is dubbed as a non-traditional belief. Cult officers distribute handouts at seminars showing symbols to identify at crime scenes, accompanied by their meanings, as if Satanists worldwide universally use the symbols in precise configurations with identical meanings. Law enforcers do have tools adequate to do their jobs. The FBI serial crime psychological profiling model incorporates, without the satanic bias, the proper questions to ask to correlate a possible criminal ideology to ritualized, that is, committed similarly on multiple occasions, violent crimes. In short, law enforcers must remove the cult from cult crime and do their jobs accordingly, close quote. What in effect this suggests is that what matters in detecting crime is what has happened, not the motive for it. While this may be applicable to routine reactive police work, it is grotesquely inapplicable to the business of crime prevention. Intelligence departments exist to study criminal patterns and motivation in the hope that this may help preempt the development of a crime swing. By excluding Satanism, Hicks was advocating the partial blinding of U.S. law enforcement. Inevitably, this type of distorted analysis took its toll on the third grouping inside American investigators, the non-aligned professional faction. The effect can most markedly be seen in the work of Ken Lanning of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, when in February 1985, he opened America's first ever conference on daycare center and satanic cult sexual exploitation of children at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. His speech was neutral, his tone measured. Quote, when unusually bizarre events are reported by a child, more than child sexual abuse may be involved. However, investigators have not yet been able to determine whether or not children are really being murdered and sacrificed, or even whether snuff films do exist. The lack of firsthand confirmation of bizarre child sexual abuse has made investigating reports of such activity difficult. The offenders themselves are part of the bizarre nature of the cases. In some instances, investigators have found that the perpetrators are not traditional pedophiles. Instead, they are involved in child sexual abuse in ways unfamiliar to investigators, such as cult ritual activity. When dealing with this unknown, law enforcement often finds it difficult to formulate an investigative strategy that will prove successful. The many unanswered questions about daycare center and satanic sexual exploitation of children illustrate the complexities of the issue in this new area of investigation. Conferences and consultation allow investigators not only to share what they have learned, but also to contribute to a broader understanding of the problem. This first conference establishes a common bond among its participants, allowing them to realize they are not isolated in fighting yet another area of child sexual abuse. Close quote. Now compare that with the paper Lanning produced in October 1989. Quote, bizarre crime and evil can occur without organized satanic activity. The fact is that far more crime and physical child abuse has been committed by zealots in the name of God, Jesus, and Mohammed than has ever been committed in the name of Satan. Many people don't like that statement, but few can argue with it. Blaming Satanism for a teenager's vandalism, theft, suicide, or even active murder is like blaming a criminal's offenses on his tattoos. Both are often signs of the same rebelliousness and lack of self-esteem that contribute to the commission of crimes, close quote. Within that 5-year span, Lanning had apparently abandoned his open-minded policy for that of the skeptic. And yet his analysis, even in its choice of an example, is surprisingly flawed for such an eminent law enforcement authority. Apparently, satanically motivated youth crime may indeed be evidence of adolescence inadequacy or disturbance, as Lanning argues. But as with tattoos, the investigator needs to ask which came first, the crime or the disturbance. The tattoo analogy is apt. Some organized crime operations, notably the Japanese Yakuza, require their members to wear ornate and identifying tattoos. International criminal intelligence departments from Tokyo to New York, San Francisco to London recognize both the typology and significance of these markings. Research has shown such understanding to be vital in the law enforcement effort. The same thought process needs to be extended to any allegedly organized crime group. Satanic child abuse networks amount to organized crime and should not be excluded from scrutiny on the grounds of religious freedom alone. To be fair to Lanning, his cautious analysis is concerned more with redressing the imbalance of information presented at satanic abuse conferences caused by the energetic efforts of Larry Jones and his ilk. To this end, he advocates a sensible, secular approach by investigators of apparently satanic crime. Quote, the law enforcement investigator must objectively evaluate the significance of any criminal's spiritual belief. In most cases, including those involving Satanists, it will have little or no legal significance. If a crime is committed as a part of a belief system, it should make no difference which belief system it is. Law enforcement officers who believe that the investigation of satanic occult crime puts them in conflict with supernatural forces of evil should probably not be assigned to these cases. If, however, such officers must be or are assigned, they will need the power of their own spiritual belief system in order to deal with the superstition and religious implications of these cases. The religious beliefs of officers should provide spiritual strength and support for them, but not affect the objectivity and professionalism of the investigation. There must be a middle ground in this issue. Concern about satanic or occult activity should not be a big joke limited to religious fanatics. On the other hand, law enforcement is not now locked in a life and death struggle against the supernatural forces of ancient evil. Law enforcement officers need to know something about Satanism and the occult in order to properly evaluate their possible connection to and motivations for criminal activity. From a community relations perspective, they must also learn to respect spiritual beliefs that may be unpopular, but that are not illegal. The focus must be on the objective investigation of violations of criminal statutes. Close quote. Admirably, even-handed though Lanning's conclusions are, such has been the heat generated by the international law enforcement feuding that such rational approaches are frequently ignored. The case of the McMartin preschool, which we shall examine in Chapter 7, shows how the polarized debate has paralyzed effective investigation. Inside the law enforcement community, it claimed its biggest victim when, in March 1989, Sandy Gallant ceased gathering intelligence on satanic cults. Although she occasionally agrees to act as a consultant on ritual abuse investigations, her former work in researching and analyzing trends stopped when she left the field. And yet her intelligence has been among the most important in understanding the changing nature of devil worship and its relation to ritual crime. Quote, I think if you look at the historical aspect of Satanism, then you can clearly see that ritual child abuse is almost a prerequisite for the ceremonies. These days, the groups I use to monitor work differently. They claim to be the purists, the Puritans almost, of their religion, and it is a very much more intellectual pursuit. But you will always get one or two who take their group in a particularly perverse direction, possibly as a result of the historical context. That is not a universal feature of modern satanic practice, but it does exist and ritual abuse does happen. Law enforcement needs to be aware of that and of the nature of any cult, Satanism or no. Close quote. With a footnote. A summary of the recommendations for investigators of satanic ritual crime drawn up by Gallant and her fellow professionals appears in Appendix 2. End footnote. That Gallant has been a casualty of Satan wars within her own profession is a disgrace. But what of the real victims of satanic abuse? How has the system served them? Therapy for ritually abused children. Quote, no other type of abuse is as long-lasting, as damaging, and as demanding of therapists as satanic ritual abuse. Not only is the actual clinical work with the victims far more complicated than ordinary molestation cases, not only will there frequently be immense problems with the child's family, but on top of everything, society doesn't want to know and will round on those who will try and tell it, close quote. Pam Hudson has a clear-sighted view of the problems of counseling ritual abuse victims, both adults and children. She has seen scores of patients in the years since she began to confront the reality of such crimes in 1984. Nor is she alone. Wherever social workers have encountered ritual abuse survivors, they have needed to use a markedly different type and intensity of therapy than would have been needed in molestation cases without any ritual aspect. According to Judith Dawson, Nottingham's child abuse consultant, quote, there is an immense barrier of fear. These children appear to have been terrorized by what they have seen or been made to take part in. Just getting beyond that can present a real challenge to the social worker, and it can take a long time. And after the child feels safe enough to disclose, the process may go on for years rather than weeks or months. In my experience, social services departments and police forces are not really able to cope well with this lengthy process because it costs a lot of time and money, and because it can confuse or disrupt any prosecution based on the children's evidence, close quote. The disclosures typically come in recognizable stages. At each level, the child victim has to come to terms with articulating a particular aspect of the abuse and with trusting the adult therapist with information that implicates him in bad behavior. Pam Hudson has developed a clinical model of this pattern of disclosure. Quote, the first thing that will come is the sexual and physical abuse. Then the children will typically describe having to endure being defecated upon and urinated upon. Next will come the fact that they have been made to eat or ingest this stuff in some way, and they have a very hard time with that part of the disclosure. It will progress from there so that they describe torture and the killing of animals or children. The very last thing that usually comes out is that they have had to eat the flesh of the dead babies. They really have a hard time coming to terms with the ingestion of flesh or blood, be it from animals or humans. That really is the very last thing they will tell you. It takes them a lot of courage and the therapists a lot of time and patience to get to that point. Yet I have heard that from many children in many cases. Close quote. Hudson's technique may now use this developed model, but that does not mean that she coaxes or leads children into disclosing abuse they have not suffered. She has watched with a wary dismay the collapse of a number of ritual abuse cases after therapists have been discovered employing leading questions or applying undue pressure to get results from the youngsters in their care. Nor is this a uniquely North American problem. The structure of most Western legal systems can mean that victims of child sexual abuse, ritual or otherwise, place foster parents and therapists in the role of initial evidence gatherers. Inevitably, such evidence has frequently been contaminated by inexperienced interviewers asking leading questions. We will see how this has developed into the dangerous myth that almost all such interviews are inadmissible when we examine the Nottingham case in the next chapter. But that it happens at all is an indication of the inadequacy of the legal structure to handle abuse cases. In 1990, the Secretary of the English Criminal Bar Association, Anne Rafferty, QC, spelt out the problem. Quote, if you visualize, let's say, a notional 8-year-old in a foster home with a sensible, loving foster mother, and she comes home and complains of what appears to be sexual abuse with overtones of Satanism or ritualism, she'll say a certain amount, and typically the warmth of the foster parent will mean that instinct says to wrap her in your arms, sit her on your knee, let her spit out whatever she can, and then, when she comes to a halt or becomes distressed, ask, draw out the rest. If when she becomes distressed or grinds to a halt, the questions that come from a loving, worried, competent foster mom are what lawyers would call leading. Did he touch you, sweetheart? Did he take your knickers down? The damage to the potentially successful prosecution has already begun. It doesn't take much to work out that the lines of cross-examination will be, well, you hadn't thought of knickers until your foster mom told you. It wasn't something you said first. Then, when the child has spoken to her foster mom, a social worker will arrive who will also want to assure himself or herself of what's going on. There may well be another chronicle from the little girl, which may mean further questioning, possibly more finely honed than foster mom's, possibly not. But in any event, another account number 2. Then the police will arrive. They may arrive with a social worker, so we will be saved one further interview, but they may not. It's not an ideal world. And the potential for it going on and on and on increases with every hour. It's nobody's fault, given the system as it is now. Close quote. As we shall see, two of the most important cases of alleged satanic ritual abuse in Britain and America, Nottingham and McMartin, have demonstrated the truth of Rafferty's analysis. Children have been repeatedly questioned with varying degrees of professionalism. Skeptical detectives have seized on apparently unending disclosures as evidence of improper counseling, and defense lawyers have routinely claimed that social workers obsessed by Satanism have somehow indoctrinated children into making false and fanciful statements. That much of this argument is bogus and self-serving appears not to matter. Once the idea is abroad that ritual abuse disclosures are the results of leading questions or unprofessional therapists, the truth gets lost in the smokescreen. To some extent, and particularly in Great Britain, social workers and their supervisors have only themselves to blame. There has been no attempt empirically to assess the patterns of disclosure, nor the relative impacts of ritual abuse compared to ordinary sexual abuse. Only in America has such scientific research been carried out, and then nearly a decade after the first survivor stories began to emerge publicly. In October 1990, the University of California's Department of Psychology, together with the Research and Education Institute of the Harvard UCLA Medical Center, published the findings of its own scientific trials. The study took 3 matched groups of children as its samples. One was drawn from the victims of an alleged ritual sex abuse ring in a preschool. The second came from a similar preschool case in which the perpetrator's sexual and physical abuse had no ritual or satanic context. And the third was a control group of similarly aged children from the same background who had never experienced any form of sexual or physical abuse. The aim was to compare the effects on the children's emotional and physical development. Quote, there were several differences between the 2 groups reporting sexual abuse. The ritual sexual abuse group alleged ritualistic and terrorizing acts in addition to sexual abuse, endured much community controversy and disbelief, and was involved in lengthy, highly publicized legal proceedings that resulted in no convictions. On the other hand, the children in the sexual abuse groups reported sexual abuse without ritualistic or terrorizing elements. The perpetrator admitted guilt, and he was quickly sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail. Analysis indicated that anal intercourse and foreign object penetration were reported more significantly in the ritual sexual abuse than in the sexual abuse group. In the ritual sexual abuse group, vague statements about sexual abuse and disclosures about less intrusive sexual abuse were likely to precede disclosures about highly intrusive sexual acts. Ritualistic abuse was disclosed significantly later in the course of treatment than any other types of abusive acts. Footnote. The report uses the term ritualistic in a rather general sense. From its contents, it is clear that what is meant is genuine ritual abuse in the terms of the Finkelwort definition. End footnote. Interestingly, while a sizable portion of children in both ritual sexual abuse and sexual abuse groups retracted their allegations at some point in treatment, 27% for RSA and 23% for SA, all but one child in each group subsequently redisclosed, and many revealed previously undisclosed acts. The retractions in the SA group are especially intriguing in that the perpetrator admitted molesting the children and the community was highly supportive. Close quote. That finding confirmed what sexual abuse therapists worldwide have known for nearly a decade. Victims routinely retract their disclosures, frequently out of fear, embarrassment, or shame, only to reinstate them once the therapeutic or law enforcement response is supportive. But in ritual abuse cases, that support is rarely forthcoming, and the retraction gratefully grasped by the skeptical detectives. As we shall see when we consider the Nottingham case in Chapter 7, this pattern was used to justify an increasingly hostile police attitude. The UCLA report drew out a series of important scientific conclusions from the study and made recommendations to the law enforcement, judicial, and therapeutic communities on the best methods of handling cases of ritualistic abuse. Quote, ritualistic sexual abuse of children has major effects on their functioning. As compared with non-abused children, children reporting RSA exhibited more behavior problems, had more negative attitudes generally, and towards school and family in particular, were highly fearful, and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, showed more sexualized behaviors, and exhibited a stance of hypervigilance towards the world. The majority of the effects listed were more severe in the group of children reporting SRA than in the group of children sexually abused without ritualistic or terrorizing elements. The treatment of children involved in ritualistic sexual abuse must focus on concomitants of powerlessness and specifically on anxiety and fear. Some of the most pervasive effects in this study on children's functioning involved fearfulness, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and other symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. These symptoms were also among the most likely to persist at follow-up 5 years later and must be addressed in the treatment of children reporting ritual sexual abuse, close quote. The study noted that non-abusive parents in SRA cases were similarly more severely affected, with divorce rates higher than the ordinary sexual abuse groups, that the process of disclosing took much longer for the RSA groups than the SA groups, but that the child victims of ritual abuse can heal given therapy. Only 17% exhibited the same worrying level of emotional or behavioral problems 5 years after their original disclosure. That 83% of the children in the RSA group had been, to whatever degree, given successful counseling is a tribute to the therapists concerned. According to Pam Hudson, most work in conditions of isolation from their professional colleagues and, in particular, without support from the law enforcement process. Quote, we're really on our own in this. People just don't want to know about it. When you tell them and when they see you believe in the existence of satanic ritual abuse, you are attacked and attempts are made to discredit you. There are 3 major charges leveled. The first is that we just want fame and fortune. We're just making ourselves famous by doing ritual abuse cases in the hope that it's going to bring us money. Alternatively, we are accused of having a pathological preoccupation with the idea of ritual abuse. The third accusation is that we are all fundamentalist Christians and therefore we're seeing the devil everywhere. Speaking for myself, I'm not a fundamentalist, though I am Presbyterian, and if you know anything about Presbyterians, you'll know they are very dry Christians. If we have a problem, we simply appoint a committee rather than consulting the Bible. It's wonderfully middle class and middle of the road. I don't in any way accept that the Bible is always accurate or has a monopoly on wisdom. As to the rest of the charges, let me make it clear. When I get a case that winds up being about ritual abuse, I get very depressed. They take up much too much time and energy compared to the numbers involved. You don't get fame and fortune doing ritual cases. If anything, you get grief and poverty when you get involved in this stuff, close quote. Grief, poverty, and danger. Some therapists, not all of them Christian and none of them fundamentalists, fear for their souls, have reported attempts to terrorize them when they have become involved with counseling satanic abuse survivors. According to Pam Klein, a highly respected Chicago-based child sexual abuse therapist, quote, some of my colleagues have been issued with personal weapons by local police forces. I am personally involved with one therapist who, after she began working with a child victim, received a human arm through the post. This is not anecdotal. I know it to be true. Will I put you in touch with the therapist? No, I will not. She is in enough danger as it is, close quote. Nor is the danger confined to the occasional activities of those who wish to dissuade investigation. Pamela Hudson has now ceased to work with adult survivors of satanic ritual abuse because of the threat of violence from them. Quote, my private practice is in my home, and I won't now invite any adult survivors into my home. They are destructive, dangerous people. One moment they might be very compliant, but the next, in a different alter, the multiple personality disorder, persona, and they're threatening to burn down the house. I saw one such patient who I saw at the public clinic. She developed such an anger towards me. She grew paranoid about me. And when I went on vacation, she decided that I wasn't answering her phone calls. She began to make threatening phone calls. And the next thing I knew, she was going to burn me out. In the end, I had to get a restraining order against her. I knew I had to draw the line, and I won't do adult cases anymore, close quote. The success of Hudson, Klein, and other therapists prepared to face up to children's stories of satanic abuse has been achieved despite the resistance and opposition of the law enforcement community and in the face of a vociferous campaign to isolate and discredit them. Early in 1989, Hudson tried to warn her counterparts in Britain about the backlash they would inevitably face. Quote, it's happened to all of us who work in this field. The idea is to shoot the messenger rather than hearing the bad news he or she is bringing. It's a way to discredit those of us who are prepared to acknowledge the problem. You'll get discredited too. It's a baptism by fire, and I think you should just sort of expect it. It goes with the territory, close quote. Her prediction was fulfilled to the letter. Not only were individual social workers vilified, but the oldest and best respected child welfare charity in the country was subjected to a sustained level of criticism unknown in the consensus-dominated politics of child welfare since the abolition of child labor. By 1989, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, has been concerned about children's satanic abuse disclosures for several years. It had quietly instructed several of its area offices with established ritual cases to examine the details and draw up an internal briefing document. On 17 July that year, prompted by the Cook Report program detailing evidence of a number of such cases, the NSPCC issued its first public statement on the problem. Quote, the NSPCC is becoming increasingly anxious about the existence of ritualistic abuse involving children in this country. Tonight's Cook Report and developing concern within the professional network are adding to this. It seems clear that children are being sexually abused, coerced, threatened, frightened, and physically assaulted in ritualistic ceremonies. A major fear must now be that children have been killed or that the lives of others are seriously at risk. The initial response to allegations of ritual abuse is often disbelief, followed by denial and ridicule because the children's accounts of events often seem unbelievable. The NSPCC is very concerned that children must be listened to and that professionals and parents should not simply discount the children's testimony as fantasy, close quote. Within hours, the NSPCC was hit by a backlash from police officers, skeptical therapists, and national press. Many treated the entire subject as a bad joke, a spoof which the society had been gullible enough to believe. A week later, Dr. Alan Gilmore, then director of the NSPCC, responded, quote, I don't think there's any made-up bad joke about it at all. We have more and more circumstances where there seems to be a ritualistic element in child sexual abuse cases, and we need to take it very seriously. We had something like this when we first discovered sexual abuse. People wouldn't believe the children at all and sent them back off to the perpetrator to be punished for lying. I think the same applies here. We need to make this public. We need to get across a public awareness and understanding that these things can and do happen, because it's only when you get across that background that children's stories are listened to. But we also need to all work together. doctors, social workers, the police, the probation service, teachers, and the NSPCC. All the professionals working with children need to share and cooperate. Otherwise, we won't get to the bottom of this. Close quote. There is a bitter irony in that last remark. The evidence brought forward to disprove the existence of organized satanic ritual abuse and thereby discredit the NSPCC consisted of two celebrated cases. In both, the issue of ritual abuse had been raised and then very publicly dropped. Yet both in the McMartin Preschool and in the Nottingham, the reason for this collapse was not lack of evidence, but the lack of precisely that unified and cooperative approach for which Alan Gilmore had pleaded.